Well, good morning. So we are continuing on our series on who we are here at the Grove, and we've looked at kind of these certain words that describe our DNA. We've looked at the word, how we are participants. We believe that if you come to the Grove and if you are here, then we hope that you know, and if you're brand new, you're only going to stay in your seat for so long because we believe we are called to participate in worship together. We believe that we are one was one of the words that we looked at. I can't even see those words. We looked at we are missional, that we're called to be sent out and to go out into all of the world. What's that one right there? I had them all memorized. Authentic, thank you. We believe that we are authentic. That's an example right there, that we are real. And then this morning we are looking at this word creative. Hopefully you've heard us say in many times in years past that we hope and desire to be the center of the arts. We hope to be a place where artists can come and not only just be here, but also to thrive and to grow and to feel accepted and to feel used. Now, the interesting thing when you ask the question, are you creative? If you were to talk to somebody in this room, for example, and if I asked you the question, who are you as a person? How many of you would say, oh, I'm a creative? So by a show of hands, if that's in the first sentence or two, I am a creative person. Could you just show of hands? Let me just gauge this really quick. And some of you went like this. It's a classic sign of a creative person. Maybe. Now, could I put your hands up if you are creative, if that's how you'd categorize, you need to be proud of that. Palmer, put your hand up. I'm going to call you out. Now, if you were to take that same list of people, and we all saw you say that, part of being a creative is being willing to expose who you are and to show people your art. You can't be a creative and stay at home and never show anybody the stuff that you've created. So out of that same group of hands, I would like a couple of you to raise your hand, and you're going to come up here on stage and show us how you're creative. So I'd like to see that hand. Sissies. One person. Thank you. Is that Grace? Proud of you, Grace. So the thing is for some reason, we all feel that this idea of being creative is for somebody else. Somebody who's 15 and can just throw down and create stuff, and you look at it, you go, what's the first thought when you think that, or when you look at that? My first thought is, I could never do that, which is probably true, but I really could never do that. And it's unbelievable to see how certain people have tapped into the creative side of life. But I don't think that's how it was supposed to be. I don't think there should be certain people that are creative and other people that are not creative. You see, there's a verse, and we've looked at this in the past. Ephesians 2:10 simply says, I am God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. If you look at that word, simply handiwork, it comes from the word poema. We even had a conference here, and we called it poema. And it means that you are God's work of art. A poema is a beautiful creation, a beautiful piece of work. When your dad says to you, you are a piece of work, I've always responded with, thank you very much. Yes, I am. Because that's exactly how it is. You look in scriptures, it says, we are God's workmanship. Every single one of us are his beautiful piece of art. And yet as we think about that statement, when I ask the hands, are you creative? Hardly any of us raised it. I actually thought the percentage would be higher. But there was probably only 5% of the hands that went up in this room. And this morning, as we look at this, I hope at the end of the day you leave here going, I am creative. I hope that you take ownership of this whole world that I think God is calling us to live into when he says you are God's workmanship. You are his work of art. You are his beautiful creation. That it's not just a few people that claim that, but it's everyone that holds on to that. A couple of weeks ago, I was blessed to go to LA, and we went to a church called Mosaic with the pastor. His name is Ern McManus. And he has been my hero for probably 12, 13 years. You're not supposed to have Christian heroes, but he's my Christian hero. If they had trading cards with his picture, I would buy it. And I wouldn't trade it. And so I used to always listen to his podcast when I was living in Guatemala, and I've read all his books. And so we were able to go. They asked us to come out and be a part of their staff meeting and listen to how they create and what they do as a church. And then we went out to dinner with him. And then we went to their church, and they met Wednesday night at 8 p.m. I don't know about you, but Wednesday night at 8 p.m. sounds like a horrible time for a group of people to meet. And so we're standing there, and the doors open, and hundreds of hipsters walked in. A bunch of 20 to 30-year-olds that just slammed the place full. And as they were there, they began to worship. And as soon as the band started playing, every person in the room just absolutely threw down. And as I was talking to Erwin and some of his staff, they said, we have a very creative community. And they meet Sunday nights as well. And I said, what do you do like on a Super Bowl? Like, what do you do during that? He goes, oh, Super Bowl doesn't affect us at all. Everybody comes. They don't even know it's a Super Bowl. Now, the Academy Awards or the Oscars, we don't get anybody here. I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, literally no one shows up. But as I was watching them worship, I found myself a bit jealous. Not of the community, not of Erwin, not of the church, not of the people, but a bit jealous that these people were able to engage in worship and embrace who they were. This idea of they were created. And they were holding their hands up, and they were standing there before just this entire congregation saying, this is the most important thing in my life. And I have a feeling that a lot of times we have a tendency to hold back who we really are. We don't embrace a lot of the spiritual things that God has gifted us. Erwin wrote a book, and it's called The Artisan Soul. And the subtitle of the book just says, Crafting Your Life into a Work of Art. One of the things that he says in the very beginning, he says, creativity should be as common as breathing. The great divide is not between those who are artists and those who are not, but between those who understand that they are created and those who have become convinced that they are creative and those who have become convinced that they are not. You know, when you look at just even this idea of the arts or being the center of the arts, we instantly go to painting or drawing. But I was thinking about all these different areas: cooking, programming, painting, sculpting, drawing, building, writing, telling stories, creating music, singing, carving. I got a huge scar from carving when I was a kid. But there's all these different elements that are about being creative. Now, when that happens, you see so much about how it can change the life around us. When you are with somebody who is creative, you see how the things that they create drastically draw other people in because they want to see what is happening and they want to be a part of all that is going on. I've always loved how Jesus lived his life. I think it's one of the things that attracted me most to Christianity was simply because if you observe how he went through life, he was constantly walking and constantly going. And when people asked him questions, he would stop and he'd look at them and he'd begin to talk to them. And most of the time, he didn't answer their question directly. Most of the time, he would say, let me tell you a story. And he'd sit down and he would talk to them. You see, Jesus was a master storyteller. And as he went through the moments in his life, telling and using his craft, person after person came, and they wanted to be a part of that story that he was telling. For me, that's how I identify. My mind works, it's more image focused. It's more focused on events than it is facts and figures. And so for years, I struggled with how God made me because I felt like I wasn't good enough. For example, if you look at my notes this morning, I think we have a picture of them. If you look at my notes, it's not normal. But for me, it makes sense. And it doesn't even go linear. You start in the left-hand corner, you go to the right, you come back around where it says Jesus was a storyteller. You go over to the brain, you go down to the verses, you go back over to the 12-year-old that we'll get to in a minute. Then you go to the 2, the 6, the 12, down to the con and the div, we'll get to that, and the 95%, go straight down after that. Eventually we'll talk about bread. I'll take my Sawzall, I might cut something, and then we end with Jesus. And so as we go through this morning, I hope that you can follow the story that brings us into this central understanding that we are all creatives. My mind, I remember, and I've told this story before, but my sophomore and junior year, I was in French class. Miss Malloy was my teacher. I thought there was a chance that we might get married. Slight chance. But I had a chance. And I remember I took classes from her, and one of the things that we had to do every other week was take a vocab test. 20 words English, translate it to 20 words in French. Very simple. Memorize the words, you get an A. I kept struggling and kept failing. And so I took it home one week, and I felt like this was the moment with Miss Malloy that I needed to make it work. It needed to all come together this week for some reason. I don't know. So I studied, and I studied, and I studied, and I had my mom come and help me, and I made pages after pages after pages for about a week and a half, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of 20 words. For whatever reason, I felt like I had to master those 20 words. I went in and I took my test, I sat down. I thought I did okay. At the end of the class, she had finished grading them. She walked to the back of my row because that's where I always sat. It's easier to be avoided in the back. And she put the test down and she just looked at me and she says, Paul. And on that test was a giant red F. You're shocked that I got an F? And I just looked at it and I looked at her and she was standing above me looking at me and she goes, Paul, why don't you at least study? And I said, study? I'll show you study. I opened up my backpack and I pulled out the papers and I said, for a week and a half, I've been studying with my mom. I said, I've done everything humanly possible. I don't know what else I can do. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, there's something wrong with you. And then turned around and walked away. And I remember thinking, something wrong with me? There's a lot of words that I wanted to say back to her. And I remember distinctly walking out of the class, hands in my pocket, walking down, turning right, going into my art class. We were doing a drawing assignment at the time, and so I sat down at my drawing station, and I just started drawing. And when I drew, I got lost. And all the, you need to do something, why don't you try harder, all that stuff disappeared, and I just drew. And so for years, after football practice or track practice or after school, I would go home, I'd go down to my bedroom, and I would sit down on my drawing station, and I would just draw. And it would just release me from the world. And I remember thinking, God, why did you make me this way? But I have to be honest with you, I thought that for only a second. Because as I sat there and drew, I remember thinking, I'm proud of the stuff that I'm drawing and creating. And I identified more with the creative side of life than I did with the logical side of life. Besides, French, who really needs to know that language? I'll be fine. But I got an F in English too, so that was a problem. You know, it's funny how that weakness, in quotes, sticks with me over time. About 6, 7 years ago, during our Christmas Eve service, Colby, who was our worship pastor at the time, came to me. He says, I want you to memorize these three verses. And when you come up, I want you to come up in between these two songs, and I want you to walk right to the stage, and I want you to stand there, and I want you just to say the verses. I said, okay, I'll write them down. He goes, no, I want you to memorize it. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll write it down. He says, no, Paul, memorize it. I want it to be quick in and out. You got to memorize it. I said, Colby, I can't memorize it. He goes, it's 3 verses. Anyone can memorize. I said, watch me. And to be honest with you, for 2 weeks, I studied 3 verses. Now, you psychologists out there are going to come and talk to me afterwards and say, we have a cure for this. We can fix these things. I'm fine. I'm okay with who I am. Leave me alone. And so I remember walking up on stage, and I remember having my wife quiz me, and I remember driving to church, and Christmas and Easter, this place doubles, and so you need to invite those people during the year as well. That's just a side note. But as I was coming into church, I felt nauseous. I'm like thinking 3 verses. How hard can this be? So I went in my office, and I wrote them down on an index card, and I put it in my pocket. And I walked up on stage, and I came up to stage, and I came to the mic, and I just simply said, and I said, I don't even remember what verses he asked me to memorize, but I said 4 words, and they were all out of order. It would be like order out of the is then they went there. What? And everyone looked at me like, seriously? Somebody made this guy a pastor? And I looked at Colby, and he had this look of, really? Somebody made you a pastor? And so I pulled the note cards out, and I read the verses, and I walked off the stage. Sorry, Seth. And I remember walking off the stage and going, it's right back at it. It's the same failure. It's that same weakness. Ephesians 2:10, if I go back to that verse, we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. Those works, those beautiful things of art, those ways that we create, those ways that we live our life that tells stories. Whether that's writing or music or singing, carving, painting. All those areas are the areas that I identified with. And because of this one little area I struggle in, for some reason, that's what I identified with. I go back to Genesis 1 as one of my favorite passages, and it says this. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. I've always identified with that because I look back to the very beginning. He created the heavens and the earth. He created everything that we see. He creates everything that we use. And then it says that he created all of that for us. Everything that we see has been created for us. And then it says that he formed the dirt and he breathed into it and he gave it life. And he said, this has been made in my image. And because of that beautiful act, it holds me to this true core value of who I am and how Jesus made me and what I'm called to be as a person, regardless of those struggles. Now, the interesting thing, if you think about who we are as humans and how we develop it, 12 years old is a key year. Because at 12 years old, we begin to transition from a kid to an adult. And when we transition during that 12-year-old phase, we begin to hear words like, you shouldn't do that, you can't do that, stop dreaming, stop imagining, stop drawing, and start learning and start focusing. Don't wear that, pay attention. And society shifts with 12-year-olds for some reason. It's as if a giant boot is stepping on them. Back up a little bit. If you look at a 2-year-old and how they learn, one of the things that say about 2-year-olds is you can place a 2-year-old anywhere and they'll learn that language in days. They say the 2-year-old mind is brilliant because of its way to absorb languages. And then as a 2-year-old grows up to about age 6 is kind of a key. When they're focused on the arts, when they're focused on imagination, when they're focused on creating things, you give a kid a crayon and for 2 hours they're good. Your walls will look bad, but they're gone. You give them a stick, they're full of imagination, dreaming. There's no kid that you can't ask, hey, do you want to come create something with me? Do you want to come build something with me? Do you want to come draw? All day long, those kids will say, yeah, I want to do that. But then, as they grow up, when they get to the age of 12, something begins to slowly shift. And I've thought about that age for me and who I am as a person. And that phase of can't, shouldn't, wouldn't, stop dreaming, stop creating, stop doing those things, and start learning. I realized I skipped it. So when I was 12, I lived in Bainbridge Island, Washington. Then I got on a plane and flew to Bangkok, Thailand. Then my parents put me on another plane with a bunch of junior high kids and sent me to boarding school at Delotte School. And I lived in a dorm with 25 junior high boys. There was 2 adults that lived with us. In the mornings, they'd come wake us up. At the night, they'd tell us to go to bed. As soon as we heard them say, go to bed, they'd come in, they'd pray with us. They'd leave, they'd go into their room, and they'd shut the door. Chaos. And we'd go out and play war in the jungle. We'd sneak all around. We'd climb trees. We did all kinds of stuff. And so from the ages of 12, 13, 14, 15, that's the life I lived. I remember moving back to the States, and I began to hear people say, Paul, you shouldn't do that. And I'd ask the question, why? Well, because other people will notice. So what? Well, Paul, come on, stop it. This idea of imagination then began, it felt like they were sucking that out of me. There's 2 types of learning. There's convergent and there's divergent. Convergent learning means that from this idea, it takes you here, and then that takes you here, and then that always will have this end result of this. A divergent thinker will come here, then maybe go over here, then maybe end up here, then maybe go 17 different directions, and meant to go that way eventually, but somehow ended up here, and it's still good. In our teaching, it says shifts from divergent thinking as kids to convergent thinking as kids. And one of the studies they did is that 95% of all 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds have switched from divergent thinking to convergent thinking. So what happened then is imagination and dreaming and creativity has now been replaced with logic and fill in the blanks. And this is how you have to do this. And this is the end result. And that's what you need to become. From a creative standpoint, that's incredibly difficult. But from a spiritual perspective, it's also hard because there's so many different paths that I think that we could pursue with this beautiful relationship with Jesus, and yet we're told to do this and this and this. And then what also happens through that process is we begin to fear risk. We're afraid of failure. And so things that we want to do, the areas that we'd want to create, we then say no. And when the question is asked, are you a creative, you only raise your hand like this, or you don't raise your hand at all. For me, risk is a beautiful thing. When I was in college, I went to college wearing cowboy boots, blue jeans, a white t-shirt, and a black cowboy hat. But as I was driving into campus, I was listening to Run DMC, Kool Moe Dee, KRS-One, Boogie Down Productions, Houdini, Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, the whole thing. And I rode like that. Ma'am, how are you? And I went to college to learn as a civil engineering major, dropped all those classes, ended up with 9 credits my freshman year. What do you do? And then listened to these guys that were forming a rap group. And I went to them, I said, I want to be in a rap group. They said, we're not a rap group, we're a hip-hop group. And I said, I can be a hip-hop group. I don't know what that means, but I think I could be a part of that. And so I looked at this part of creativity. I equate that with risk. And I also understand that there's this point where you have to decide, am I going to do this or not? And if I'm terrible at it, I'm going to figure it out. So my junior and senior year, I practiced 4 hours a day with this band, in quotes, band. And you can ask my wife, she can validate it. And we got to the point where we were good, and not just kind of good, but really good. And every time we performed, that was my art, that was my way of creating. And I'd gone from drawing and these other things, and I've always looked at this way to, how can I create today? And it was interesting how God brought me into that path. Never did I think that a dude from Montana would go to college and get in a rap group. Wasn't in my plan. And I remember thinking, this is good. Now, for those of you that are doubting me, I'd like to show you a picture. Guy in the middle, right in the crosshairs. That's me. Striking the pose, that's a difficult thing to do. Now, the interesting thing, 20 years later, we took family pictures. Here's the family portrait. Still got it. Still rocking that pose. Let's get rid of that. When we are looking at how do we create, how do we live, there's this inner voice that speaks to us that is saying you need to create with your life. You need to do more with your life. You need to not be afraid of failure. You need to not be afraid to try new things. And so when we talk about being the center of the arts, it's very important to us that we know that is not just for a few people, but that is for everyone. Palmer and I were talking this last week about how there's different phases in our life where we create. One of the things that he said that impressed me is he said he didn't even start writing till he was 40. So there's been different areas in my life where I feel like God has called me to create. And then there's times when I listen to those voices that tell me that I can't. About 12, 13, 14 years ago, our family didn't have hardly any money, and we needed bread for food. And so I made bread because it was cheaper and it didn't taste very good, but I started making bread. And as I made bread, my philosophy in life is that I shouldn't just do it okay, I should be better than everyone else in the world at it. That's my goal. In fact, side note, when we were at McManus's church, he said, look, in your job, each one of you should strive to be the best that you can be in the world. Not just okay, but to be the best. He said, my desire is to be the best speaker in the world. And I gave some of my bread the other day to one of our elders, and I said, how was it? He goes, that was 4-star. It was good. Like 4-star? There's supposed to be 5 stars. Why are you only giving me 4 stars? He goes, well, no. I said, no. Tell me why I didn't get 5 stars. And so I went back that next week, and I made it, and I'm 4 stars. I'm going to give him 5 stars. And so the next week, I gave him some bread, and he came back to me the next day. That was 5 stars. Thank you very much. But when I look at bread, when I look at this bread that I create, for me, I look at this as part of my art. And I've shared bread years in the past, and I've always talked about this. But the reason why I've come to love bread so much is because if you look at what we buy in the store, a loaf of bread, you look at the ingredients, there'll be 10, 15, 20 different ingredients. True artisan bread, and this is what, as I was reading his book, he has a section on artisan bread, greatest thing I've ever read in my life. But he talks about how true artisan bread has basic ingredients. This only has flour, water, salt. And it has to have the exact percentages of the flour and the water. I started baking that loaf of bread, what day is it, Sunday? I started baking that Friday evening. All night it rises Saturday, and then I craft it again on Saturday, Friday all night, Saturday during the day, then I have to fold it and I have to treat it at certain times. I have to be very attentive to what the bread is doing. I have to walk alongside it. And as I'm creating it, I'm not looking at it as bread now. I look at it as this is art, and I'm creating. How do I get the circles to be perfect? How do I get the crack to be exact? All of these things matter because I want it to be perfect. As I've been processing through how I create bread, I've also looked at how I approach my faith. Good bread baking is about focusing on the basics and doing those basics well. And not doing them well, but trying to craft them till they're perfect. And working at this basic ingredient and this basic procedure over and over and over again. Jesus has asked a question in Luke 10:28. He simply asked the question, do this and you will live. Now, if you read right before that, they're asking Jesus, what is the best thing to do? What's the most important commandment? Keep in mind, they're always following him. They're always asking him questions. They're always coming to him with, hey, what should we do? And Jesus in this situation turns back to them and says, what do you think we should do? The question was, what is the most important commandment? What is the best way to live? And he says to them, what do you think? And they say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And he looks back at him and he says, yeah, do this and you will live. And so for me, as I've looked at what does it mean to be a Christ follower, that core principle is to love unconditionally, to love him with everything that I have, to love others, to love those around me, and most importantly, I believe sometimes is to love myself. We don't believe that we have the value to be in his world, to be created in his image. Like this bread that I craft, it also goes back to that passage in Genesis 1. You are created in his image. And we get too distracted by all of these other different things that pull us off this path that he's calling these basic principles of loving unconditionally. You know, when Jesus uses people as examples of good faith, he always points to the children. He says, you need to have the faith like this child. Every single time. I think there's something for us as adults to understand when Jesus says, look, this is the most important thing, to love unconditionally. Forget about all this other stuff for a minute. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your body, your soul. You want the best example of a Christ follower? Do you see that kid over there? With this unabandoned creativity for life and this reckless pursuit of Jesus. I believe that the children, when Jesus spoke, would listen to his stories and not come back with, well, yeah, but what does this mean? Which is what the adults always did. The kids would always go, yeah. I don't know all the other side stories, and I don't really care. That was a great story. I want to be just like you. Having that faith of a child. All of us have these things that pull us in different directions, and all of us have these areas where that for some reason we've built up that don't allow us to go fully in with our faith. About 13 years ago, my wife and I lived in a 100-year-old house. And I'd been remodeling it over a long time, and I was in a year phase of waiting to be called into ministry, and I was staying at home, and my wife went off to work. And I told her, I said, while you're gone today, I had changed out a window, and I was going to trim it out. It had been like that for a year with just a window stuck in the wall, and I figured it was time to finally put in the trim and make the window look pretty. So I said, when you come back today, I'm going to have this window fixed. And she said, okay. And so as I got out my stuff, I found some trim in my backyard, and I put the first trim in. But as I was standing there in the kitchen, I kept looking over on this wall, and this wall right here had some cabinets on the bottom, but nothing up above. And I kept coming back, and I'd look over here, and at one point I stopped, and I'm thinking this kitchen would be much better if there was a window right there. And I just, well, forget it. And I go back over here and look. You know, the sun would come in. It would be absolutely perfect. Why didn't the builder put a window here? It made no sense to me. Kept coming back, and eventually I just put down all my tools. I went over, I got my Sawzall. You can ask my wife on this story. And I literally just, and I cut a hole in our house. A giant hole. And when my wife came home, I'd found a window, and I put it in there, and she said, what are you doing? I said, there needed to be a window here. She goes, right, but there wasn't. I said, well, there is now. She goes, you told me you were going to finish trimming out this window. Now we have a giant hole in our house, and neither one of them are done. I said, but look at the light. It's just so much better. I don't know how, but we sold the house with 2 windows, and neither one of them ever finished. But for me, that represents who I am, and there's these distractions that are constantly calling us in a different path. Bread for me is the basic core principles of faith. That window was this distractions that are always pulling me in a different way. In Psalm 139, it says this. Verse 13, it says, "For you created my innermost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful." For me, as I look at what it means to be creative, what it means to be creative, what it means to create, I have to embrace, first of all, that my life was made in his image. Irwin wrote in his book, he says, "Nothing in the universe is more finely crafted or better designed for divine purpose than a human being. You are God's preferred medium to express himself and reveal himself. God took great pleasure in creating a creature whose material is the substance of earth and whose essence is in the image of God." You know, when you look at who we are and what we buy into and the voices that we listen to, and we look at how we create, whether that is through storytelling or painting or singing or building things, or all of these different areas that we don't realize or tap into are creative. All of those things tell the story about who you are. When you're creating, you're telling other people your story. And you looked at how Jesus created with his storytelling. He pulled people in. And constantly people would stop what they were doing and just turn. A great artist has the ability to make people just come and stop and observe. And I believe that is how we are called to live. John 10:10 says, "I have come that you may have life and have it to the full." And for me, that is about embracing these basic core principles of what it means to pursue Jesus, what it means to create. Josh is going to come up, and one of the songs that they're singing this morning is called Oceans. And it simply says this: "I will call upon your name, for I am yours and you are mine." If I strip everything away, I have to call upon his name. I have to get to a point where I can raise my arms and say, "You created me." I have to get to a point where I can say, "I'm made in your image. I am yours and you are mine." I would ask that you bow your head. I would also ask that you just remain still. I'd ask that you just pray through who you are, where you are in life. With the busyness of who we are and how we live, it's a constant motion. It's constantly things are happening, and we're filled with all these voices that tell you you can or can't do certain things. I believe God wants us every now and then to come before him and to just be still and allow him to recharge who we are so that we can go out and bring his story to those that are around us. And so I've asked Josh if he could just for the next couple minutes play instrumental, no singing, and that we take 2 to 3 minutes of just stillness and listen to God speaking to your life. I think we think that God doesn't speak to us because we don't slow down enough to actually listen to him. And so with your eyes closed, with your head down, focus on how God has created you, what he's calling you to do, how he's calling you to create, and what are the distractions that are bringing you away from Jesus. And then when Josh moves into the next phase in worship, I ask that you stand and just release everything in his presence.